And it was basically Philip Burton who got Richard Jenkins into this world of theatre. And he went from the age of 16 being known as Jenkins Co-op because he was working in the haberdashery counter in the local co-op and thinking like, oh, this is what my life's going to be, which I guess is fine. But 2 years later, he was then on stage, and it's an amazing turnaround. But whilst he was doing that, the relationship was a bit on the rocks with his sister, and he actually registered to be adopted by Philip Burton, and that's why he got the name Richard Burton.
Hello. By the 1960s, Richard Burton was the highest earning movie star in the world. He was paid the equivalent today of $10 million a picture, but when one looks at his childhood, the mind boggles at his change in fortune. Born the 12th of 13 children, his family lived in poverty in South Wales, and his chances of success seemed to have peaked when he worked in a haberdashery shop. But by the age of 18, he had won starring roles on stage, and his life seemed set. Joining me today is historian and social media star Alice Loxton, whose new book, 18, intriguingly features 18 significant historical figures at that formative age. Coming up on the Aspects of History pod is our Market Garden 80th anniversary special as Saul David joins to discuss the Battle of Arnhem. Philip Blood and Gordon Corrigan discuss the operation as a whole. And our film club is A Bridge Too Far with Roger Morehouse and Tim Hewitt. Please do follow or subscribe so as not to miss out. And if you can give a kind rating, that would be wonderful. But in the meantime, it's 18 at 18 with Alice Loxton. Alice, welcome. Fantastic to have you on the pod. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. Wonderful to be here. Yes.
So, Alice, we're talking about your new book, 18, A History of Britain in 18 Young Lives. And actually, I should, there's full disclosure here, Alice. The majority of my listeners are not 18.
I'm sure young at heart, perhaps.
Well, exactly. Everyone was 18 once, and they will know someone who is. And so, having been reading this book, I can heartily recommend it. But 18 is that age. I don't know about you, because you're very young, but I suspect you're a little past 18.
I'm 28, yeah, so I'm on 10-year marker past, I guess.
Right, okay. Well, I'm 48.
Okay.
So I'm way past. But I actually feel 18. I don't feel 48.
No, you don't look it either.
Very kind. I wondered, what were you doing when you were 18?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I was 18, I probably had a pretty conventional 18-year-old life, I think, in that I was just completing my A-levels and was looking to university, really. And I wasn't really, I was very hardworking and just kind of, focusing on exams and that sort of thing. But I expect it's quite a similar experience to lots of people today. I didn't have a clear idea of what career I wanted to do or anything like that. And it's very interesting with me, I suppose, in that I currently work now, 10 years later, in a world of TikTok and Instagram. And when I was 18, those things didn't even exist at all in the way that they do now. So little did I know that I was about to set out on a job, embark on a career that didn't actually exist.
Did you? That's interesting, actually. Speaking about that, because social media has had such a massive impact on our lives.
Yeah.
For those who choose to engage in it. You are a massive presence on all these platforms. It's had a sort of purely beneficial impact on your life?
Yes, social media gets a lot of bad press, often for very good reason. But there are some aspects of it which I think are pretty amazing. I treat my social media channels, which is where I just make these short videos about historic locations. So I go to churches or cathedrals or castles and just show people amazing details. And I treat it as basically a TV channel, in the same way that you'd create things on iPlayer. But of course, these are just mini documentaries that are only 3 minutes long. And the response has been absolutely amazing. It's been an amazing way to reach so many people, to grow an audience. And it's not just me, there are a lot of people making all sorts of different kinds of non-history related content, whatever their passion is. And I think it's really wonderful that we do have access to these channels where, you know, you're the commissioner, you're the editor, you can put out as much as or little as you want. You can talk about exactly what you want, whether that be world history or whether that be the local history to your village. So it's a kind of quite a fun and creative platform, as lots of people, you know, have probably found with making podcasts, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, I've loved doing social media stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Actually, that's that kind of democratization where you're in control. It's that's very liberating. Actually, particularly, you know, I couldn't agree more. Right, so this book, it's effectively because it's a sort of a wonderful dinner party, really, involving all these incredible figures. Was that the kind of why did you want to write about? Why pick 18? Why did you want to write about these 18 figures? What was it? Was it always a dinner party question? Because that's like the classic question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I was walking around the National Portrait Gallery a while ago, and I was looking at all these figures, you know, all these paintings, all these portraits. And it occurred to me, of course, that these portraits depict these people in their older years, generally, when they've achieved quite a lot. Obviously, these people once upon a time were young. They were children, they were babies, they were 18-year-olds. And so I love that idea of kind of looking into that much younger age group. But also 18 is a really interesting age because in our society today, 18 is considered this big age, this age of change, this time when you become an adult. But of course, that's not true at all in the terms of kind of a much longer look back through history. And actually, it's a very modern thing to use 18 as a turning point. And so I guess to shine a light on what it means to be 18 today and what it has been for all these years, I wanted to look back through history. And of course, people have had such different experiences. Say people like Nelson might have gone to the Navy at the age of 12, or people might have been married, or they might have been in charge of Italy as Empress Matilda was, even in their teens, or they might have survived pretty horrific things like the plague. So in general, people have had a huge amount of responsibility and lived through some pretty extreme experiences. But I think that's an interesting insight into kind of perhaps how we could think about 18-year-olds today. That my gut feeling is that when people have been forced to take on a huge amount of responsibility, as people did do in the past, they step up to the mark. And actually, this could be a good lesson for us today. But, you know, throughout the book, so I've chosen these 18 figures, and these are, I hope it's a kind of good reflection of not only, you know, it's a kind of diverse group of experiences. We've got some people who are royals, the creme de la creme of society, but also people who are really ordinary, some people you've probably never heard of. And then also people from all different areas of Britain. Some people who weren't necessarily born in Britain, but they play a massive part in Britain's story. And yeah, I think it's just hopefully it's an interesting insight into British history too. And then one of the things, you know, you always ask about the dining, you know, your dinner party setting. So throughout the book, between each chapter, there is this section where I imagine the 18 figures from history that I've written about, and I imagine them coming together in this modern setting in a dinner party. And that's obviously a bit of fun, and it's supposed to be kind of quite light, but I think it's also been quite useful because you're basically forced to imagine these people not as abstract, you know, individuals, but actually what would Bede do if he was 18 years old and he walked into a restaurant? Like, what would he do, and how would he move, and how would he act? I suppose it's the same exercise that people who create historic dramas probably think about. So yeah, that's something that I just added in as well. But it's been a lot of fun to write, and I hope people find it inspiring to read.
Well, I thought I could pick out a few people from your list, and we could talk briefly about them. And Bede was certainly one I wanted to. So he's the first figure, and that is quite a funny vision of him walking into. What restaurant would you choose, Alice? Do you have a favourite?
Well, I did want to originally have it as like a pizzeria. That's how I always imagined somehow. I think when I was 18 or when I was a teenager, the classic kind of party that people would have would be like a Pizza Express. So I had that in my mind. But then I think we changed it to a kind of more generic restaurant. I think the publisher thought it was getting too abstract. But
Getting nervous about a pizzeria, far too controversial.
yeah, perhaps. So yeah, it's just the kind of. I mean, it's obviously completely surreal, that idea, like completely surreal. It's a bit like, if anyone's seen BBC Ghosts, that kind of series where there's all these different people from history coming in to different, in this like modern setting. But yeah, I mean, Bede is a really interesting one, and from a historical, from a historian's point of view, people will be surprised that I've been able to write about him, because we
He's
really
the British
don't.
Herodotus, isn't he?
Yeah, the father of English history, they say. But we really don't know anything about his life, on like his young life at all. Like, we really don't. There are a few tangible things. I mean, for people who don't know, he was this Anglo-Saxon monk, and he lived in this monastery in Northumberland. There were 2 monasteries that were built, and he basically stayed there his whole life. And he spent his whole life writing in the scriptorium and writing all of these texts. But it's through Bede that we can understand the early English, the history of English people, in those very early years. So it's in some ways through Bede that we have perceived where we've, our origins and where we've come through and all this kind of thing. So he's got a massive legacy. But who was Bede? I mean, we often think about Bede as this old guy, probably with like a big beard, working in a scriptorium. But of course, at one point he was young, and he would have been. We know that he would have been in this monastery. There was a monastery at Wearmouth and a monastery at Jarrow. And although there's no kind of account of him saying, dear diary, this is what I was up to today, there's some pretty dramatic events that were happening there. You can piece together quite a lot about his life. At the age of 7, he left his family and he was taken to this monastery. What would it have been like for a 7-year-old boy to arrive in this monastery, whatever that was, which at the time, of course, was an incredibly exciting place to be. We think of monasteries as really old and kind of stuck things that are kind of dusty and cold. But at the time, it had been pretty exciting. These massive buildings with these amazing things called stained glass windows and all this kind of stuff. And so he was there, and then he moved to another monastery. And you can still see, you can go to these places today and you can see the churches which still survive with these kind of remnants. And it's amazing to be in those rooms and think, hang on, Bede probably was in this room. He could have stood where I'm standing right now. He could have looked through the window that I'm looking through right now. So that's pretty cool. But there's this big event that happens to Bede in his young life, which we think is Bede, in that there's this terrible plague that strikes the monastery, a terrible plague, and everybody dies in the monastery apart from one boy and one adult. And it's believed that that boy was Bede. And historians will just write this as if it's like a side note, like the plague came. But if you actually imagine that, I always tell people to think about their school hall. Like, I imagine the hall at my school where there was hundreds of students chattering, giggling, laughter, whatever. Imagine you were there, and then at the end of the year, you came back to that hall and you had seen every single person in that room dying in this horrific way. You probably carried their bodies out, and then you're the only one left. That is a crazy experience to go through. And what would you feel at the end of that? You think, hang on, I feel like I've been chosen to be here. There is a reason that I've survived. And is it surprising that Bede then goes on, and throughout his life, he is so dedicated to being in the scriptorium and writing all of this stuff and making the most of his life, I guess, not wasting a moment, dedicating his life to the monastery. So, that's the kind of themes that I'm kind of unpicked with Bede. Obviously, it's very different to writing about Bede to some of the much later ones where there's too many sources and diary entries and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's a bit about Bede.
Well, no, it's interesting because the youth aspect that you write about in the introduction, actually, which, as you say, isn't really addressed by historians. I mean, I was talking to a medieval historian about the Black Death,
right?
Where some ridiculous percentage, I forget now, of the population died, as you've kind of illustrated with an earlier plague, and everyone must have been wandering around traumatized. So if you made 18, you're kind of you've won the lottery ticket.
Yeah, well, our perception of age and maturity and old age obviously changes throughout history. When in the past, basically, if you got to the age of 18, you were incredibly lucky to be there because so many people died in infancy. There was such high levels of infant mortality, even to recent years. I mean, if you take Mary Anning, who's one of the characters that I write about, her mother. So Mary Anning was the famous fossil collector, paleontologist, who lived in Lyme Regis on the south coast. And her mother, they were a very poor family, but her mother gave birth 10 times. And 8 of the children died. So only 2 survived out of 10. And Mary Anning was born in 1799. So, there are people who are not that many generations back where there were 8 out of 10 children dying, which is pretty high level. So if you think that's quite recently, and further back in history, it would have been similar and perhaps even worse.
Well, you've said you've written about people that some people might not have heard of. Mm-hmm. And there is someone here who I don't think I had heard of, and I'm going to try and pronounce the name properly in Gaelic.
Oh,
Fingal Nich Dominel.
Yes, well, actually, you have heard of her because that is the name of the young Flora MacDonald, who was who saved Bonnie Prince Charlie or helped Bonnie Prince Charlie escape. And the reason that I use the Gaelic name is because that is the name that she would have known. She didn't know herself as Flora MacDonald at the age of 18 because that was an anglicised version that became popular after, this heroic moment. And it was a kind of name given to her by the English. Her fans gave that to her when she became this celebrity. So that's been interesting as well, because there's a few names which are different. So Horatio Nelson is in the book, but as a teenager, he was generally known as Horace.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And C.S. Lewis, obviously, we know him as C.S. Lewis, but as a teenager, you're not C.S. Lewis. And though he was called Clive Staples Lewis, he actually went by a kind of nickname of Jack. So if you met these people, this is what I mean about if you imagine these people in a restaurant setting, if you actually met them, this is what they would be called. They wouldn't know themselves as the kind of famous name in the history books. They'd know themselves as their nickname. Yeah.
Another name so Richard Burton adopted a Burton name, didn't he? The Burton name. So I'm so glad you wrote about him, because I mean I adore Richard Burton. And actually, if he was in the restaurant, everyone would be the booze would flow, certainly.
Yeah. He's a great character. I mean, he's got an incredible childhood, and his whole story is just, when you read about him as an adult, I think there's one moment where he buys Elizabeth Taylor the most expensive diamond in the world. It's like $1.1 million or something like that. An incredible thing to do. And then you read about that, and then you read about his childhood, and you think, what? How could you live such a crazy different life? It's this amazing rags to riches story. And so Richard Burton, he grew up he was born Richard Jenkins. He was born in the South of Wales, in this very idyllic little village. Again, his mother had given birth many, many times. Many of the siblings had died, but I think she'd given birth 13 times, and he was number 12. And his mother died when giving birth to his younger brother. So Richard Burton actually never remembered his mother because she died when he was very, very young. So he started off in that family setting with all of these siblings around, speaking Welsh in this little Welsh village. And then when his mother died, his father was a pretty kind of absent father in terms of caring for the children. And so he went to live with his older sister, Sis, who was herself married. So that was the kind of mother that he knew, his older sister. And he grew up with his sister's children as well. And he was very clever. I think he was very capable. He was very good at sports, very good at rugby, and had lots going for him. But for various reasons, he did do well at school, but then he had to drop out. So he was this kind of weird school dropout. And then it was kind of difficult at home, difficult at school. And then he found this tutor, this guy called Philip Burton. And Philip Burton was a kind of really passionate about people, like helping young people, and he was really, really passionate about theatre. He had loads of contacts in the theatre, and it was basically Philip Burton who got Richard Jenkins into this world of theatre. And he went from the age of 16 being known as Jenkins Co-op because he was working in the haberdashery counter in the local co-op and thinking like, oh, this is what my life's going to be, which I guess is fine. But 2 years later, he was then on stage, and it's an amazing turnaround. But whilst he was doing that, he kind of lost touch, the relationship was a bit on the rocks with his sister, and he actually registered to be adopted by Philip Burton, and that's why he got the name Richard Burton, which is quite an incredible thing. So and actually it was a technicality meant that he couldn't quite be adopted, but it was something like it's
a guardianship or something.
Guardianship, yeah. So it was a slight technicality that he wasn't quite old enough, but isn't it incredible? By the age of 18, he had gone from being this Welsh-speaking son of a miner in this tiny village amongst all these children to actually have changed his name, completely changed his kind of way of speaking. He spoke in this plummy English accent, an actor's accent, and doing all these amazing Shakespearean performances, and on stage, and with chances of going to Oxford. And he's changed his name, and he's changed his kind of guardian. So he has quite an extraordinary journey, even by the age of 18.
I mean, I found it heartbreaking reading about his childhood, just because, I mean, as you say, you think of all the barriers that he had to get through to even actually go to school, let alone rise up and to become the biggest star. And I can completely understand why someone who lived in that kind of poverty would then buy such an incredible gift for his wife.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see. I know it's just so crazy that he would be able to afford that. It must have been amazing for his family to see that rise. But then there's these traits that stay with him forever. Wales and this Welsh identity stays with him, despite all the celebrity, all of the glitz and the glam. The kind of Welsh heritage stays with him forever, and he always says how still he, however much you might be playing Hamlet on the stage at the Old Vic, he'd still rather be playing rugby in the field, on the rugby pitches in Wales. And then, of course, his father was this drinker who drank a huge amount, and of course Richard Burton was like that as well, even though his life was completely different. So it's been really interesting to trace how obviously his life completely changed, but also those early years completely shaped those later years too.
I was reading about, and I'm going to dwell on Richard Burton intentionally just because, he's such an incredible figure. But I don't know if you've read John le Carre's memoirs, The Pigeon Tunnel, where he describes working with Richard Burton on The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, where Burton plays a hard-drinking spy. But in it, he sort of is quite critical of Richard Burton regarding the director of the film, Martin Ritt, was actually blacklisted in Hollywood in the 50s when Richard Burton was working and rising up through the ranks. But he's rather mean about Richard Burton, saying Richard Burton didn't stand up for him or something. Like, he sort of alludes to that. Now, I think that's very unfair, particularly when one looks at the background that Richard Burton had gone through. He didn't have the privilege that le Carre had in going to a nice private school. And he was also very young, I think, when he was making it big in Hollywood as well in the 50s.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how quickly he suddenly does very well. But you read about when he went to Oxford and he was in the plays there, and he was pretty young then, and the accounts of him performing and being directed in those early years, people just say, there obviously was this amazing natural talent that he had, he was, star quality, I guess, and that shone through whenever he worked with anyone, So I think it's in some ways it's that that's why he gets ahead so quickly, is because he was actually just incredibly naturally talented. But of course, to come from this poor Welsh mining background, he did need somebody to help him get into the position to be recognised at Oxford. So there are lots of people that help him along the way too. Yeah,
that voice, which you write really lovely. It's a lovely piece you write about him practicing on in the valley,
Yeah.
quite literally in the valleys
Yeah.
with his guardian. It's
Yeah.
extraordinary, really. And then there's another figure who I was delighted that you wrote about, which is Vivienne Westwood.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, she's a great character. So I
She
love
really is, yeah, incredible.
Well, she's I really wanted to write about her because obviously she's died pretty recently, and so she is technically someone from history, I think, because she isn't alive anymore. But we also perceive her as this modern figure, and part of the modern world. And so I thought that would be a really good person to include. And I just love the idea of having Bede to Vivienne Westwood, like those two linked up. I just thought it was kind of fun. But she's really interesting because, of course, she is this icon of modernity, of punk, of cool, of rebellion, all these kind of things. But when you look at her childhood, it's all those. It's almost the kind of opposite. She grew up in this village called Tintwistle, and in the kind of Cheshire, Derbyshire area, and she it's wartime when she's born. So she is born into this time of rationing, of make do and mend, and you really see that that's kind of instilled within her throughout her life. So, if you look at her later kind of works, her designs, lots of them are kind of these bits of fabric that are pieced together, almost as if you were just, during the wartime, you might kind of put like random bits of fabric together, and it's all kind of quite in some ways quite messy, I suppose. But she, there are so many bits of her childhood which kind of translate through to later years. So, for example, the area that she was living in was really important in materials and textiles. So people would have had a really good knowledge of textiles and understanding of different types of materials in the area that she was born. And, then she goes on to know so much about using all these kind of different tweeds and different materials in her and fabrics in her designs. And then one of the big events in her childhood is, well, of course, the war, and this idea of being British. And she's always playing with that throughout her later life and her designs. But also one of the images of her childhood, I think, is her watching the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, watching this young woman become this queen, become this international figure, this international symbol, as Vivienne herself would do. And throughout her life, the symbol of Vivienne Westwood is this orb, this royal orb. And so there's all these kind of bits that you can trace. But, she grows up in this little village, and it's only by chance that her parents moved to London to set up a post office. And then it's there that she can go to London Art School. But what's so interesting is that you just thought, it's not like, it was all set in stone and she just went straight through, fashion college or art school or whatever. She was full of self-doubt at the age of 18, in that she knew that she had this amazing creative spirit. Like, it was definitely there. It was definitely there throughout her school years. And yet it just wasn't clear to her, as is the case for many people today, it just wasn't clear for her how she could actually use these creative skills and talents and impulses in a real career, in a career. How can you actually make something of that? And she writes about how for her, it was only, she only thought you could be a painter. She didn't really think there's anything else you could be apart from a straightforward artist. And the idea of becoming a fashion designer was pretty kind of foreign to her, or I don't think she ever kind of occurred to her really. And she gets married and she becomes this primary school teacher, and she sets out for this quite conventional course in life. And it's only in later years that she kind of comes back to the creativity. And thank goodness she did, because then we have Vivienne Westwood. But it's amazing how she almost didn't. She was so close to not ever quite getting there. And if she hadn't have met a couple of people, or things hadn't quite turned out that way, it just would never have been. And she'd probably been a teacher at a school who was really, really good at arts and crafts and that kind of thing, but maybe nothing more than that. So it's a pretty amazing kind of, I think it's an inspiring story, because it's, you've got to just follow your passions really. And her passions in her very early years were what keeps her through until, keeps her going till the very end.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I guess that leads me on to ask, do you think that kind of rise, both Vivienne and Richard Burton with sort of humble beginnings, Do you think we're going to see these opportunities still there for young people? I mean, I suppose, there's a lot of talk nowadays about inequality in this country in 2024. One hopes, that will always, the cream will always rise to the top, but it doesn't seem like we're making it easy for ourselves in this country.
Yes, it's a good question. So with my book, the earlier figures that I focus on are people who are forced into positions of like authority, like Empress Matilda or whatever. So it's by virtue of birth, or Elizabeth I or Chaucer. But what's interesting about the later figures, the likes of Richard Burton or Vivienne Westwood, is that they are these brilliant creatives. And so that's definitely like something that changes when you look at the kind of the people who become more famous. Like in later years, people are doing much more interesting things, and they're more kind of creative geniuses, I think, with star quality. And so that's why they can come through from these humble backgrounds, because they genuinely are one in a million. But of course, they did both have. It is against the odds that they did as well as they did. I think both of them had these amazing mentors. Like Vivienne Westwood had this teacher called Mr. Bell, who was like, you should go to art school, like you should really follow this passion. And Richard Burton, of course, had Philip Burton, who was so instrumental in his success. And I suppose you could probably compare that to social workers today, or maybe like scholarship schemes, trying to get people in from different backgrounds to these kind of creative worlds. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that they have still so many problems with people trying to go into the creative world and being from certain backgrounds. So, I mean, I don't think it's Philip and Richard and Vivienne would still be the exceptions, even in today's world, I think.
Yeah. Well, last question, really, I think is I think young people get a lot of they get quite a bad rap, I think, about amongst the old generation. And I don't know if that's always been the case. People always complaining about the younger generation not being tough enough. And as you said, that we do find that all generations step up when asked. But
yeah,
do you think that particularly, with the rise of social media and things like that I guess society is far too critical? I mean, the reason I asked this is because I was asked recently on a show about D-Day. Why do young people not know 18 to 24-year-olds not know about D-Day? It's outrageous. And I was thinking, well, they will in time learn about D-Day. Yeah. It's unlikely you go through your life not knowing about D-Day. And I obviously had heard of D-Day when I was 18, and probably because I had war films rammed down my throat. But that I don't think we need to have war films rammed down our throat for the rest of eternity. And so, is it really that important that they know about? Admittedly, an important operation during the Second World War, but I guess that speaks to a wider kind of criticism of young people and their knowledge of, I don't know, the past or whatever.
I mean, I guess it's young people respecting the elder generations. But I think I was asked about D-Day as well quite a lot when that happened, and it seemed to be in the press a lot, that kind of stat with the young people. But I mean, for someone who's 20 today, that is 4 generations ago. Like, I don't think it's that surprising that people don't find it, a big kind of event in their lives. Four lifetimes ago even is a long time for anyone. And I sort of think, well, would people of the 1940s have been interested in commemorating a war from the late Victorian period? Like, that would seem really far away, I reckon, for them. And it's not to say that these things aren't important, but I do think that a trait of youth is not looking back, it's looking forward. And a trait of youth is trying to forge the world that they will inhabit and live in, and that will be their world, I guess. It's a long thing that it's always been that youth are rebelling and campaigning and protesting and all this kind of stuff, as we see with all the university students today. And I think it's just a natural thing that at the age of 18, you're more inclined to look forward than be really compelled to be looking back something that basically seems like it's not, it's obviously important to remember, but does it forge? I don't know, you can go into all this stuff. But actually the interesting thing about the report was that, which was by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, was that it wasn't that the young people weren't necessarily interested in D-Day, it was that they weren't interested in the way that they were commemorated didn't chime with them. And I don't think that's necessarily surprising. The way that we do commemorations today are pretty Victorian, like they haven't really changed for hundreds of years, like the way that we do these parades and everything. I mean, I think they're very moving, and I think very powerful, but I can understand why lots of young people might find that it's not something that gels with them. And I think it's an exciting challenge that we should make sure that if we are going to engage young people in history, we do it in a way that's really relevant to them. And, one of the ways that I do that is through TikTok and Instagram. All I'm saying on TikTok and Instagram are things which you would read in a museum anyway, but it's just being put on a platform that is the platform that young people use. There's lots of kind of museums and history kind of charities that are doing the same. So I think it's a good lesson in making sure that we're always, if we want young people to be interested in history, we have to actually acknowledge how they exist in the world, what platforms they use, how they take in information, and make sure that we have a presence on those platforms to make sure that history has a presence on those platforms too. It doesn't matter, if there's no young people who are reading the Telegraph history section, then we need, which maybe they're not, then make sure that, maybe we should acknowledge that and make sure that it's I've said it all, but that's sort of what I think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So listeners should give young people a break and not give them a hard time. That's the lesson.
Definitely. Yeah, I think so. And also, in a wider thing, I know that if I had been brought up on TikTok and Instagram, I think I would struggle. I think they are struggling. I think all of us would struggle. I think people in history, if they'd been given TikTok and Instagram, they would be all over it. And, the human condition doesn't much change. And I think it's much more a product of nurture than nature. And I think if there was, let's hope not, but if there was another war, I'm sure that young people would step up to the mark in the way that we think about the heroes of World War One, in the way that they did. I'm just sure that they would. But, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Well, no, I think you're right. I think in the 1930s, there was an Oxford Union debate where the motion which won was that I will not fight for my king and country, and which caused shockwaves at the time. But within a few years, that was shown to be incorrect because people did fight for king and country. Yeah,
and I think the it's not that this dissatisfaction with youth is a new thing. In Chaucer's day, Geoffrey Chaucer, he was a page boy, and he was, there was this big outrage that lots of his fellow youths were wearing these outrageously tight leggings, or this outfit, this tunic called a paltonk, that was so revealing that you could see basically everything in his kind of tights below. And people were so outraged by it, and so outraged by the youth of that period, that they believed that it might have caused the plague. God's wrath was so strong. So it's not new. And in the 50s, when this kind of new concept of the teenager comes about, there are so many articles in the papers, so many letters to agony aunts being I don't know how to deal with my teenage child. I don't know how they're behaving in this really weird way. I don't know how to talk to them. So the idea that we have this strange relationship with the youth, or that they're being difficult, or they're at odds with their grandparents is nothing new.
Good stuff. All right, Alice, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. And the book 18 is out in August, which is when this conversation will be out. So
okay, yeah. Well, it comes out it's out on 15th of August as publication day, which is the A-level results day as well. So it's all.
I remember that. I got exactly what I needed to get, so I scraped.
Perfect. Yeah, bang on. Yeah. Well, no, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to chat.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history to come, but in the meantime, thank you and good night.